Welcome everyone to the American Hotel. My name is Gavin Manu and I'm the publisher of the Sag Harbor Express. Today's event we're going to be discussing modernizing history, which is of course balancing preservation and development in Sag Harbor. That is not a topic that's foreign to most of us. I feel like the cover of the newspaper on a weekly basis is pretty much focused on that exact thing. So it's no easy task, but we have some experts here that have joined us as panelists, and of course we'll want to hear from all of you about what you're seeing out there. We want to thank everybody here at the hotel, Ted and Julian, Mary, their whole team, for hosting us. They've been wonderful partners for us, and we really appreciate that. Also to LTV, they film these sessions, they provide our technical support. For anybody who can't make it, they televise these sessions for us, and definitely a lot of viewers out there who are catching up what we've been up to. We also want to thank our sponsors. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do these. Our lead sponsors include the Sag Harbor Chamber of Commerce, which does a tremendous amount for the community. Thank you, Chamber of Commerce. The Sag Harbor Variety Store. I know Lisa couldn't be here today, but Phil and Diane Bucking are here today. Thank you very much to the Variety Store. John Leonard, who's an attorney, he couldn't be here today. He's got a play tonight, I believe, at the Southampton Cultural Center, which has gotten great reviews. But thank you to John Leonard, who is one of our lead sponsors as well. And to our session leaders, BNB Bank, Shay Doyle's with us today. Saybrook Capital, thank you, Luke Babcock. Advantage Title, Chris Nuzzi is here today. Thank you, Chris. The Adam Miller Group, Adam and Brian Lacazio, I believe. I don't know if Brian made it here. Okay, Brian DeSessa, of course, is with us today on our panel. Thank you both. And our session partners also, we have, let's see here, Fisher's Home Furnishings, Burke & Sullivan, F. Michael Hemmer, Land Surveyor, Save Sag Harbor, and the Sag Harbor Inn. Thank you all very much. So I'd like to move on to the conversation today. We'll introduce our panelists here in a moment. Is this microphone on? Okay. For any of you who are here for the first time, we're going to introduce our panelists with a question they've been given in advance. That way we can lay the groundwork for the discussion. I'll then turn it over to my partner Brian Boyhan, and he'll open up to the floor for some discussion, questions, comments. Please just try to keep it brief and introduce yourself and speak into the microphone, assuming it's still working. Our panel today, from left to right, is Dean Gomolka, who's the chairman of the Sag Harbor Village Historic Preservation and Architectural Review Board. Zachary Studenroth, a historic consultant for Sag Harbor Village. Bob Weinstein, who's a member of Save Sag Harbor. Anthony Vermandois, who's an architect. Brian, who I mentioned, is an attorney with the Adam Miller Group. Kathleen Mulcahy, who's the Sag Harbor Village Mayor. And Ann Surchin, who is also a local architect. Dean, we'd like to begin with you, so if you could grab that microphone. As a member since 2015 and the current chair of the ARB, how have you seen that body balance important efficiencies like solar technology with the need to maintain the village's historic aesthetic? Can sustainability and a commitment to history coexist in modern Sag Harbor?
We've approved one application so far, and it's the Tesla tile on 19 Howard Street. I think it looks fantastic. I think the typical solar panel that you see on houses that kind of are jagged or not aesthetic or problematic. But I think the solar tiles are fantastic, the shingles. And maybe if we had like a solar community, maybe there's a plot of land that people could buy into, and we could work that out, where everyone here, not just in the historic district, could buy some sort of an allowance into that system, which would be, I think, a positive way to go. Solar panels in Sag Harbor, we have all these wonderful old trees. I'd hate to see the south side of all of our streets, starting to massively prune plants. So I think maybe a community project would be the way to go, or go with the, I think Tesla now is starting a system where you could rent the solar panels. So that could be a way forward, but they are aesthetic.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there's not a lot of space around here. Zachary, as a historic consultant for the village of Sag Harbor, do you think there are ways the village could better communicate the importance of its historic district and the requirements of owning a property within those boundaries to new homeowners? Is there a way to communicate this more clearly before applicants who come before the ARB?
Yes. I guess simple answer, yes. Improvement, can always be made. I have the advantage of also consulting with the Village of Southampton, and I would have to say that we do a much better job. I think it's always an objective of an architectural review board to communicate its expectations ahead of time. We have some wonderful brochures, excuse me, that were created years ago, which are available at the building department, but they're on the counter to be asked for. You sort of have to know about this ahead of time. And so that isn't so much the problem. It's about creating materials and finding ways of getting them to prospective homeowners, purchasers of property ahead of time before the expectations are set as to what you might be able to do with your property. Certainly, we live in a digital age, and so a lot of that information should be on the website, so people can be directed to that. They don't need to come down to the building department when it's open and search for a brochure. I know I've spoken at some length with our new mayor, and she's very much on board with this and very proactive, looking to create new materials. So I think we will be doing much more, and I'm looking forward to working with her on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Bob, as a member of Save Sag Harbor, but also as a resident who has redeveloped a historic home, how has your knowledge evolved in terms of what it means to be a resident of the village and a property owner in the historic district? What responsibility comes with being a property owner in Sag Harbor?
Thanks for the question. Is this working? Oh, that's better. It's funny. I just want to start with a sort of side comment to say that I always find this topic of conversation about balancing preservation with development sort of ironic. It reminds me of a play that was shown off Broadway a couple years ago called I Love You, Now Change. So part of me wonders why people would come to a place like this if they want to change it. Now, that said, I do understand that change is a constant. Just look at our streetscape. It's comprised of over 200 years worth of architectural styles. And it's exactly, and there's also change because of, climate change we have to deal with, and we have to deal with code compliance. But the very fact that the streetscape is so eclectic is part of the reason that Sag Harbor in 1972 became a National Register Historic District. It's also what's so appealing about Sag Harbor, I think, and the reason so many both developers and new homeowners come to Sag Harbor. So there's an irony there. It's the fact of change that's made it so appealing. But most importantly, in 1972, as I mentioned, when we became a National Register Historic District, it was stated emphatically that Sag Harbor at that point in time was deemed worthy of preserving. So that's sort of the snapshot that we all in our minds have to keep, at least as a template. Now, obviously, as I said, change is going to happen. And sometimes change for the worse. Now, I'll give myself as an example. About 15 years ago, when we bought Jefferson Street, it was a rather large and historic property in the heart of the village. Now, I had been living here 10 years before that, but not in an historic house. So the idea of appropriateness sort of had eluded me, I think. I went in front of the Architectural Review Board with a proposal for 2 swimming pools, if you can imagine. And you remember that, right? And thank goodness this was shot down immediately. And unlike what I see happening often now at the review board meetings, I didn't fight for it because I was made to understand that this was the wrong thing for an historic district. Now, interestingly, and Brian might remember this, there was an article in the Express shortly after saying Bob Weinstein, brother of movie mogul Harvey Weinstein, should move back to LA if he wants 2 swimming pools. So I marched right down and told Brian, you got the wrong one. So, although actually, even yesterday, there was a phone call from somebody from the Daily Beast asking if I could comment on my brother's friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. And what I had to tell her was my brother did have a friend named Jeffrey Epstein in geometry class in high school. But again, the wrong Jeffrey Epstein. So, So, I would say that I've learned a lot. I think owning an historic property has given me a very different perspective. And frankly, I think it's made me feel much more a member of the community than I had before, and I think there's a responsibility to owning a property like mine. The first major responsibility that was sort of tested was back in 2010 when we were asked to host the 100th anniversary of the John Germain Library. That's what really got me involved in the community to the degree that it has. And I have a lot more I was going to say, but I know I've already spoken too much. But I will finish with a quote from William Morris that kind of sums up my attitude about historic preservation, and my attitude about it, which is, these old buildings do not belong to us only. They belong to our forefathers, and they will belong to our descendants unless we play them false. They're not in any sense our own property to do with as we like. We are only trustees for those that come after us. So that's what I've learned.
Very nice. Thank you. Anthony, as a longtime architect working in Sag Harbor and one who has collaborated on a number of redevelopment projects of contributing structures in the historic district, what are some of the biggest challenges you have faced working to modernize a home while also preserving its historic integrity?
Okay, well, there are challenges that occur at every phase of the project: the programming and design phase, the permits and approval phase, and the construction phase. And the challenges can differ somewhat from project to project, but there's certain themes that kind of, no matter what historic project you're working on, you kind of expect them to occur. Here in Sag Harbor, it's everybody wants to live in Sag Harbor Village, and and I think people sort of recognize the sort of cachet, I guess you would say, of living in a historic house. Yet, sort of paradoxically, everybody wants the all the amenities that they would have in a spec house McMansion and somewhere in the incorporated town. They want elevators and ensuite bathrooms and swimming pools and things like that. So so the first thing in the programming and design phase is just trying to sort of reconcile those programmatic desires with the historic house, and where do I have to rein these completely well-intentioned clients in and just say, listen, you're not going to get 4 ensuite bathrooms in this house and still maintain its historic integrity. And then also, every historic house is different, and every historic house has slightly different things about it that are most valuable. And I'm going to, from time to time, cite 2 projects I'm working on now: 156 Main Street and 268 Division Street. 168 Main Street is a sort of a classic captain's house. 268 Division Street is sort of a classic Victorian era watch case house. 156, even though it's the older of the 2 houses, has these really spectacular 12/9 windows. Some of the panes have shattered over time, but the sashes and themselves are in terrific condition. So part of that was making the homeowners understand that these windows are really special and important, and they need to be preserved, not just replaced with Marvin windows. And I kind of got through about 90% on my own with that, and then the ARB, thankfully, and Zach kind of pushed them over to 100% on that. So if you go by 156 today, you'll see the windows are all gone. Don't worry, they're all inside, having the paint stripped off. The panes that aren't salvaged are going to be replaced. So that's great. 268, different situation. The windows have been replaced maybe 30, 40 years ago with vinyl windows. There's nothing there to save. So yeah, go ahead, put the Marvin windows in here. There's nothing, you're not missing out on anything. Then you kind of go into the permits and approval process, and that kind of presents its challenges. So you come up with this great, what you think is a great sensitive design, and then you realize, well, wait a minute, it violates the pyramid law. Okay, and then you have to convince the clients to go through the time and expense of getting a skyplane variant. Whether you have a Greek revival house or a Victorian house, very often the most sensitive addition you can do is a little, a cross gable addition. But almost inevitably with our narrow properties, those violate the pyramid law. Now, some owners have the time and the patience to go to the ZBA, but not all of them do. And the ZBA, to do it credit, is usually pretty receptive about approving those kind of variances. They kind of get it. But still, not every homeowner has the time and money to do that. So, you're forced to scramble and redesign and try to avoid the sacrilege of all sacrileges, in my opinion, which is doing a front-facing gable that's the same direction as the gable that's facing the street. But so those are zoning and approval challenges. Then you go into the construction phase. Let's say you've gotten your a great design. Client is totally on board. They get the whole historic preservation thing. ARB has approved it. Neighbors are enthusiastic about the project. First day you're there, you open up a plaster wall and you realize, oh, wait a minute, that due to rot or fire damage, that plaster wall is literally the only thing holding the wall up. We're encountering this at both 156 and 268. They both houses at some point in their history had severe fires. It's a good thing both houses. It's amazing that both houses didn't just burn down. But as soon as we opened up those walls, you see those charred studs that aren't really doing anything structurally anymore. One of the things you see a lot of in Sag Harbor is people lifting houses and putting in new foundations. Now, at 156 Main Street, that wasn't really an option because of site constraints and a prickly neighbor. So even though there the foundation is in terrible condition, we're just going to have to, the sections that need to be replaced, we'll just have to do section by section. 268, this was the parts of the foundation that were visible to us underneath the main part of the house seemed like they were in pretty decent condition. The homeowner's programmatic needs didn't require a finished basement, and they didn't want to spend the money on lifting the house and putting on a whole new foundation. So I said, okay, let's just work with what we have here. We start construction, and we realized that the two parts of the foundation that weren't visible, well, there was no foundation there. I mean, the house was, these two wings of the house were literally maybe 4 or 5 courses of brick sitting on what was probably the original grade, and then the grade came up a few inches over time. We had no way of knowing that when we weren't going through the design and approval process, and now here we are. I mean, it can't stay like that. So we're just going to have to go, section by section and put a foundation under that. But, and maybe I'll just wrap this up. I mean, you can turn these sort of challenges into advantages. And just using this example of this foundation, the upshot of it is we're going to get a nice full basement under there, and we're going to move some of the programmatic elements, the laundry room, pantry, which we had sort of crammed on the first floor, into that unexpected basement we're getting. And, that'll open up the first floor plan a little bit, which I think will be good for the homeowners in the end, despite the sort of extra expense and time that they're going to have to do with dealing with this repair.
Okay. Maybe when you retire, you can go work for Farrell Building or something like that. A little simpler. Brian, as an attorney representing a number of property owners redeveloping homes in Sag Harbor, are clients prepared for what the requirements are for homes in the historic district or in a neighborhood like Sands, which was recently recognized on the state and federal level for its historic importance? This is kind of like what Zach was talking about in terms of communication and understanding.
The answer is it depends. So it depends on it depends on who was advising them and who was assisting them through the process. So in the historic district, the designated district, I think they are more apt to that with the designations of contributing or not contributing structures. Brokers, lawyers will advise them on that, or they should be advised on that as to what you can or cannot do. I think the communication, some of that boils down to, we have a zoning code, we have a building code as to, for instance, is the gross floor area. You can take a lot, you can figure out what the code supports in your gross floor area calculation. And if you have 2,000 feet of house, the code supports 3,000 feet. A lot of people are going to say, I could add to 1,000 feet. Which, under the code, yes, you can. However, it's subject to some other constraints, whether they be zoning, as Anthony discussed on, or as Dean discussed on, architectural review board, and how that's going to relate. So there's no assurance of that. So that's confusing for buyers, because the buyer's question is going to be, okay, I have a lot that supports a 3,000-foot house. There's 1,500 feet there. I can add a 1,500 feet. Not necessarily the case, and there's no definitive answers on that till you either have a plan from an architect, such as Anthony, or you have a discussion with the architectural review board, or you've reviewed the house with, potentially the village consultant in Zach. So, I think education and communication is really important on that. I think it becomes more challenging as you leave the historic district because the regulations are less and less stringent. So I know that the recent designation of sands, but there's no. Right now, in the historic district, you can go in, pull a tax map, and find out if that structure is contributing. You can look at the footprint of that house and find out what specifically on that house is contributing. If you go into the Sands neighborhood, you don't have that same level of information, so it's harder to advise on that. And then in certain situations, those are larger lots, potentially, in the Sands neighborhood. And, a seller's looking to maximize value, and the buyer's looking to, optimize value in terms of what they can build there. So, if you have a house that's an 800-foot cottage on a half acre, the seller's going to want to sell it for as much as they can. And that means a contemplation of what the redevelopment value of that lot is in most cases. If someone wanted to preserve that 800-foot cottage, the homeowner could file a covenant or restriction on it, but then you're going to impair the value. So that's, you have a value consideration there in some of these areas and structures. I think one of the biggest things that people can do is, if you're buying a house, if you're looking to redevelop a house, before you get too far down the road, when you're working with an architect, go into the architectural review board and have a discussion. So on most of the projects I handle in the village, before you get a full devised set, we'll have a discussion with the architectural review board. If it's a historic home, potentially a site visit with the architectural review board to see, what their position is going to be, where it can be added. While it's new to us and old to us, you look at other parts of the world, there's 300,000, 400,000, 500,000-year-old towns that have 500-year-old buildings with new additions. So there's a way to do it. I think it all boils down to education. One of the most, I would say, enlightening, one of the things are, you don't want to, and Zach actually said it on an early application, I'm probably years ago now before that, you don't want to be confused as to what the historic part of the house is and what the new addition is. So that's kind of the advice that I've always imparted on clients, to say, we don't want a historical reproduction. And these are Zach's words, but I've used that as an example for people buying in the village to say, the library is an example of that. When you walk by, whether you're a historian, an architect or not, what part of the building was historic and what part of the building is new. So I think that has to be the mindset in any redevelopment or addition in the village. That's a key point in determining that.
All right, thank you. Kathleen, the Sands neighborhood that we were just discussing, subdivisions earned state and federal recognition, named to the National Register of Historic Places and state landmark status in 2019. The neighborhoods continue to be at the center of residential redevelopment and real estate speculation. How will the Village Board of Trustees work with the Sands communities to protect its historic character?
Thanks, Gavin. Right before I answer that, though, I do want to just follow up a little bit on Zach and Brian's question. We are, in the village government, doing something called What It Means to Live in Sag Harbor. It's going to be a brochure. It will describe all the boards, all the processes one goes through, and really talk about what it means to buy a historic house and everything else, a little bit more modern than the pamphlets that exist right now. We're working hard to get that done by the summer season and to give it to all the real estate brokers around, as well as just have it on the website and everything else. So that can help with that communication. So as far as SAMS goes, we are, as a village, really proud of the work that Renee Simons and Dr. Vera Key and Dr. Ranger did to get that historic preservation registration.
Yeah, and just so everybody understands, knows what Sands is, it's Sag Harbor Hills, Azareth, and Nineveh. I don't think I mentioned the full name.
And they did that on their own. They did not do it with a lot of assistance from the village. They went and they got it. They did what was contributing, all the survey, everything. And it's fabulous. We're really, really thrilled for them. And now it's time for the next step. They've gone, they've done it. It behooves us all to have the conversation of, do we want the local designation? And it's really up to the residents up there. So when the executive committee and the residents are ready to do that, the village will be a partner with them. We will help them do the hearings, do the filings, whatever they need, we're there for them on whatever they decide. But to Brian's point, it's a double-edged sword. You know, you want to keep that size and scale and that historic feeling up there, but it will change some of the values, and it is, it's a conversation that's going to be long, heated, I'm sure, at times, but something that has to happen. It's just, they've gotten it this far, it would be foolish not to take it to that next step. If indeed they do go for the local designation, then we will, with Dean's group and the HPARB, we will stand by that and protect that designation as we do with our current historic district. If they decide they don't want to do it, we will still help them try to balance the size and scale without the regulations per se. So it is in their court. We're just here to help when they decide to do it.
Okay, great. And also, we're going to be having our next session is going to be on that exact topic about the Sands communities in February. Okay. I don't think this is working, Jason.
It is working.
Anne, how does your experience as both an architect and member of Southold's Historic Preservation Commission influence your thinking on preservation? Is there anything Sag Harbor can learn from the North Fork or vice versa?
Well, yes, actually. I think we can learn from many other municipalities as well. I think you have to get creative. We had a situation, this was a couple of years ago, where the main road going through Riverhead out to the Laurel Lawn, which then goes from Riverhead Township into South Hope Township, was going to be designated as a historic district. And Riverhead had worked very hard on this. And part of it was in the census tract, which meant that people who were in that area would be able to take advantage of rehabilitation tax credits, because part of that area is listed as a distressed area. And anyway, when the people from the State Historic Preservation Office got down here and they got to the lower line, they said, we can't stop here. All these wonderful farm buildings cross the line. The historic buildings really didn't stop or end at the town line boundary. And so they quickly wanted us to piggyback onto them. And all the research had been done on these houses in South Hope. But because this happened so fast, the Riverhead people were all on board, and the South Hope people, this was all new to them. And then we had this one guy who was like a guerrilla. He came in, and he came to the meetings and the hearings, and he started spewing a lot of lies, a lot of misinformation. He was a very good speaker, and he persuaded people that, their homeowners insurance would go up, their property values would go down, and our supervisor just looked at him in the eye at one hearing and said, I used to be the tax assessor. When you have a landmark house or landmark district, your property values actually go up. And so because of this one guy, he was able to, mobilize a lot of other NIMBYs. Basically, the Riverhead people decided to withdraw the application. So this goes to how you discuss preservation, how you present it, what you do to garner enthusiasm for a project rather than hit somebody over the head with it. And so that's something that we learned on our own, but I can see that in other communities going on. And so you have so much misinformation out there about historic preservation that it becomes a big issue of education. And we just redid our brochures, and I'm on the vice chair of the Historic Landmarks Commission, Preservation Commission of Southold, and so they're in the Chamber of Commerce, they're in real estate offices, they're in all the libraries, and they're everywhere else we can think of, basically. And it's been quite helpful. We also have on the property cards in the tax assessor's office, every house that is landmarked is flagged historic, so that when somebody purchases a property, if they haven't already found out about it, they learn prior to purchasing that they are buying a landmarked house in the township. not necessarily part of the historic district. So, all of those things are important, and also the collective will of the community. I think is very, very important. In Orient, we had a very controversial case recently where this man bought a small Bayman's cottage, and then he hired a Hamptons architect to come over and enlarge it, and they were trying to put basically a big mansion on a third of an acre, needing a zoning variance and approval from us. The addition that was being put on the house made the little Bayman's cottage look subservient to the addition, which is completely antithetical to what what the Secretary of the Interior standards require. So it's a very educational process, and I think also government plays a role too, where if you have an illegal tear down, and for example in Southampton, if you're going to be building a multi-million-dollar house and somebody comes in and tears down a historic property and they only get a fine of $1,000, I mean, what good is that? And there's a town in Illinois, I can't remember the name, but if something historic is torn down there, the fine is the value of the house itself, which is a little draconian, but they haven't had tear down since they instituted that regulation. Anyway, so those kinds of things matter, and there's a middle point between all of them. But I think that when the community is in a rage and the politicians listen, sometimes good things can happen,
Okay, thank you. I am going to turn it over to Brian. He is the former editor of The Express, going back to the 80s, so he's been following this issue for many, many years. Brian?
Hi, folks. So this is your chance to ask some questions. This afternoon is really about you and your opportunities to talk to and ask questions about the village, to the panelists. Historic preservation here, as Gavin said, in my 30-some-odd years, been probably the most controversial subject in the village. So let's start. Who's got a question for our panel? Yes, Chris.
So I'm curious, what do you think the repercussions should be if somebody tears down a historic building? Do you think the fine should be greater than they are now? And would that make a difference?
Well, let's start with Kathleen, probably would be the most logical place to start.
Yes, I think they should be much higher. Right now, if I understand it correctly, and Brian, you can maybe correct me if I'm wrong, New York State limits it at $1,000, which is a drop in the bucket. I mean, it's insulting. So, yes, I think it should be much higher. I don't know about the whole value of the house, but I think a percentage of that value is something that makes sense. And it's got to be high enough that it makes, somebody somebody buys something for $1 million, they want to tear it down, then put another $2 million house.
It's got to cost them.
It's got to cost them.
If you want to prevent it.
Yeah. So, yes, I would like to see it higher. I don't think it's within our ability to do that, as I understand, but maybe we can talk to the governor if he comes out this summer.
Maybe you could also help with that as well. Is there an opportunity for municipalities to work together to perhaps lobby Albany to increase those penalties?
Well, I don't see why not. I mean, I think if all the municipalities out here, banded together and wrote a letter to the governor even, not just one, let's say it's Southold Township and Southampton Township and Sag Harbor and Orient and, the individual historic districts within all of these municipalities wrote letters. I mean, then that's a force to be reckoned with. Mm-hmm. And I think, and also remember when that fine system was instituted. Those fines haven't been raised in years.
Right.
They've been around a long time at that one level.
Right.
So,
Dean, can you explain maybe what the process is? Because I know there seemed to be a year or so ago a rash of buildings that were coming down with just their door frames left up. Does the ARB get involved in flagging that at all, or raising that to code enforcement?
Yes, and the neighbors too. A lot of us drive around because we're looking at houses, that are before us, applications, and we'll notice something and call up Tom and say, hey, maybe we could take a check of what's going on that property. The stop work order has been our best friend. 20 Grand Street, we almost lost that historic building, and thank God for the stop work order. That's basically the tool that we have at hand. We've approached the mayor, and she's been working diligently. I think she's going to add more resources to the building department, so hopefully going forward, we'll be more on top of things.
Great, thank you. Brian?
Yeah, so just to that on 2 points. Yes, as a village resident, which is, again, some of my interests that I represent clients on, I don't think the fine is the solution. In other municipalities, when you're dealing with value, as such as Chris said, when you're buying something for $1 million in land value, and what's that structure worth? So if that structure is worth 20 or 50, they're going to pay that fine because it's not a detriment to knocking down that house. The detriment as a village resident, not as a representative of developers, is time, because time is money. So in other municipalities that I work in, if you were to tear down a historic structure without permission, you're barred from applying for building permit for a year, 9 months, another set of time. So shooting myself in the foot here, but in terms of as a village resident, I mean, that's more, you're not, it's a difficult path to increase the fine, and what's the fine before it becomes meaningful? I don't see that as in my opinion, as a course of prevention.
We have that situation, I think, in a lot of aspects about the village legislation. I think for back in the day when we had bars and clubs, it was the cost of doing business.
It's the same thing.
To pay a fine. Yeah, exactly.
I totally agree with Brian that I think it's more than fines. I think it's the fear of getting a stop work order and being dragged before the review boards again is enough to kind of make people think twice about about doing that. And I try to explain that to my clients as well too, and especially the builders. If they're starting to go gung ho with I talk about having to replace burnt or rotted timbers. Yeah, that's true. But when they start going into the stuff that isn't rotted or burned, then you have to say, listen, you don't want to do this, even though it's easier than you, because we're going to get the stop work order. We're going to get dragged before the ARB, and it's just not worth losing the time for it. So, yeah.
So to Dean's point, stop work order is a great friend. Yes. Just give us your name.
Victoria Sharp. There was a case reported recently in the East Hampton Star, and it was an individual chopped down a lot of trees. And the fine that was levied, now it may have been from a different entity, not the village, it was maybe CPF, and I don't know if anyone knows it, but the fine was $1 million per tree chopped down. Now, I'm sure on appeal, it's going to, but so some entity had the power to levy what I would think would be the kind of fine that would get in the way of people doing this again. But I don't know if anyone on the panel knows.
Sure, so that is not a municipality leveraging that fine. That's a court action where someone's alleging that's what the damages are. So if anyone's been involved in a court action, you can really allege anything. So it's more for paper value. I'm not involved in that case, but that's what the situation is. It's not something that a municipality could legally leverage against in terms of that sum.
Yes.
On Grand Street, you're actually making them take down the house that they built, the faux historic, which is...
They were previously approved for.
Yeah.
We're replacing that microphone. I'm sorry. That beautiful structure, and then we granted them even a larger addition than we usually would because they were going to take the care to restore that old structure. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way, so they've had 3 or 4 stop work orders to help bring this to the conclusion that we achieved.
And you're making them take down that new thing that they already built.
Oh, for sure. And
yeah,
the corner boards had nothing to do with the design of the old structure, so we will get that restored.
Right.
Kathleen, I'm sorry, Bob, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that maybe this is naive of me, but I would like to think, and again, using the little anecdote I gave about the pools, that before we even get to the place where we're imposing fines, which clearly they're not high enough, or a stop work order, I really think education has to be emphasized in a much more real way. I know at Safe Sag Harbor that we've proposed a lot of different seminar topics that we're in the middle of trying to get done that help educate the community about what basically can and can't be done. And I was happy to hear Kathleen say that, the brochures are, being updated and, made stronger. But I also feel that, very often people need to understand that they're becoming part of a community. Now, granted, developers don't feel that way, but why enter into a community that, resistance is everywhere around you? Try to understand, that exactly what it is that you love about this village and where you see the value in the village. If it's a financial decision like a developer is making, is what's already here and not what you're going to change about it. So I think education is really important. I think an understanding that our preservation code is 5 decades of hard work by people who have a lot of people here sitting at this lunch today worked on it as far back as 1972 when we first had a Historic Preservation Commission, and then 1986 when the ARB was or Board of Historic Preservation and Architectural Review was first formed, and then worked on, I'm such a nerd, I happen to bring the CRIS book, the Creative Resource Information Systems Guidebook, with the 830 contributing structures. There's been a lot of work here, and I don't want to make it so dramatic, but it's sort of spitting in the face of all these people over 5 decades who have done this work to protect the village and pass it on to newcomers. Education is really, really important, understanding that you're part of a community. We have to live together and appreciate what we have, which is, the biggest asset is the historic district and the harbor, I would say.
Sure, Ann?
Over in the North Fork, it isn't just newcomers. It's the people who are there who feel that landmarking a house is a violation of their property rights. And they are, in some instances, the worst offenders, because I have no respect whatsoever for these historic properties and the districts. And we had 2 members of our town board who publicly stated that they were anti-preservation. They thought it was a violation of property rights. So, so you have to sort of elect the right people to represent you.
Right.
And also with that project in Orient, our supervisor, Scott Russell, is pro-preservation. And when there was a hearing to our landmarks board shot it down, and then they appealed to the town board, and then ultimately the town board shot it down. But at the hearing, they were presenting their whole ridiculous case all over again, and near the end, the supervisor said to them, well, clearly, you want to live in Orient, you just don't want to live in a historic house.
Yeah.
And that was the issue. So, I think you have to look at preserving historic houses locally before they even get to the newcomers. And for example, in Madison, New Jersey, there was this 1730 Luke Miller house. This is many years ago. And the mayor and the borough leaders bought the house. And then they put all kinds of protective easements on the house, and then they put it up for sale as a single-family residence. So whoever bought that really couldn't do too much with it. And it was, a pretty gutsy thing to do, and the house did sell. So I think you have to think out of the box, too, in some instances where there may be a house, it may not be one that could be torn down so readily, but you want to really preserve it as it is. You just have to kind of dig to come up with ways to save them as well.
I agree with everything Ann says, but I would add that part of the education is for people to understand that historic properties do have more inherent worth than a new built property. I know this, ridiculous example, but when I buy furniture, which I don't do anymore because I have my basements are filled with furniture. But, I buy vintage pieces because they maintain their value. They're sort of irreplaceable at this point compared to, say, going to Room and Board and buying a new sofa. I think it's a good analogy. So that's part of education. Understand that the assets we have are inherently worth more than any new build could ever be worth. And people will have a different attitude.
Anthony, in your experience in the architectural community here, is there a willingness, do you think, among architects to educate their clients? Is there much of an effort?
Yeah,
is there resistance from the clients?
I think there is. I mean, certainly for my part, I think it's there is resistance though from the clients, and sometimes it's just not really knowing any better, or as I said at the very beginning, it's maybe not fully understanding what the value in their houses. I mean, I'll give one example. Another little tiny project I'm working on now. This was the previous owner of this house was who about 10 years ago when we were doing the whole moratorium thing. This was an individual who was crying bloody murder about everyone else's projects in the village, including my own. And she wasn't unjustified about what she was saying, but then she went ahead and she replaced her historic windows with these Anderson clad windows, which is just my opinion, just a huge no-no. And I don't think she meant anything wrong about it. She got all her approvals and everything, and she just didn't know any better. And now here I am with the new owners trying to figure out what are we going to do with these windows to make them look a little more historic. And it's tough. I mean, I'm going to be at the ARB next week about that, and we're going to see what we can do.
Another question? Yes.
Thank you. Myrna Davis. This is a question for Dean, Zach, and/or Anthony. If a house is historic, a contributing house, and it's rebuilt, like the Morpurgo house, so essentially there's not much left of the original house, is it still a contributing house?
And that house was, a lot of the phones of that house on Union Street were there. Billy Joel's house, for that matter, I think had been gutted over, the last 30 years. Yeah. So there's nothing left of that building.
But
the trim
why was it allowed to be gutted if it would ruin its historic value?
I'm not sure why people destroy great things, but it did happen there. But Union Street, that was a beautiful restoration.
Now that the house is rebuilt, how do you feel about what how the character of the neighborhood? How it fits.
It's in keeping. We're talking about Union Street is in keeping of the neighborhood, and that house was close to being slated for the dumpster. So, thank God for Anthony and his client. They restored that wonderful building, I guess, for another 100 years.
What?
One thing I'll say about 6 Union Street, which you don't really see from the outside, but that timber framing, it's all still there. Right. And that's one thing you have to understand about these historic houses is some of the stuff that you see from the outside, the shingles and the clapboards and things like that. Those were always intended, even when they were originally built. I mean, they understood that over time those shingles will deteriorate and they're going to need to be replaced. So I think, it's when you decide what aspects of a historic house to preserve. I mean, that's every house is going to be a little bit different because, as I cited in 156 Main Street now, it's the windows that are there and they're in good condition and they're worthy of being saved. At 6 Union Street, the windows were not in, they weren't original and they were in terrible condition. It just wasn't an option for that one. And at 268, which I cited, the windows aren't even there. They're not even the original windows. So it's, and that's part of the education process with the homeowners and also the builders is helping them identify what is for your contributing house, and that actually might be a nice thing to kind of be a little more specific in Sag Harbor's list of contributing buildings is what specifically is contributing about it. What are the most special features of that house?
To just take that a little further, if something is contributing, we'll often at the meeting say, we'll have to schedule a site visit. We'll bring Zach, and he'll say, oh, these are the kerf marks indicative of this period or whatever, and he'll recognize these windows were replaced or not, and we go forward from there.
Yes, sure.
I think one of the things that should be considered, though, is an entire streetscape and the scale of it, because I think we're in danger of becoming Stepford Harbor. When you look at Howard Street, which was one of the most charming streets in the village, or Rector Street, which is ours, as each house is considered on its own without considering the scale, eventually the real character of the neighborhood is eroded. And I feel that's what's happening, that it's hard for these boards, they're not encouraged by the lawyers to really deal with these looser concepts of what character consists of and scale consists of. So if they're just looking at the particular property and the particular house, we lose some of the quality of what really was Old Sag Harbor.
You know, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I think one of the challenges too, it's not just the historic houses themselves, but the infill houses. You know, when you have a ranch house and you want to replace it with a new house, you know, there you're I mean, there are certainly the same sort of zoning, the setbacks and the pyramid law and things like that, and GFA come into play, but still, it's hard to convince somebody who's building a new house on a new piece of property. Why does their new house have to match the same scale as the two little Victorian watch case houses on either side of it? You know, that's a challenge too, and that gets to the whole thing about preserving streetscape. And I'm not sure what the right answer to that is.
I mean, I think the zoning code, if it's adhered to properly, does talk about harmony. I think that's the most important tenet in the code about scale, harmony, and character. And I agree with Anthony completely. I mean, I promised myself I wouldn't talk about specific cases, but when you think about the National Register taking a snapshot, and then you think about what happened on Main Street over the last couple of years, without talking about the pros or cons of this particular house, but Lorraine Haynes's little house next to the Napier Howell house, that is then next to Gigi Morris's and Bob Plum's Queen Anne house. I mean, there was a cadence there in the streetscape that was meant to be protected. There was negative space as well as positive space of the house, and the negative space is gone because of infill, because of the new house that was built, and because of how close it was put on the street. And I think also, and I have no idea what the solution to this is, but I think also that it took precedence over, in the same way that the standards from the Secretary of the Interior talks about a new addition should not subsume the original part of the house. This new infill house is sort of subsuming the predominance of the Napier Howell house. When you come down Main Street heading north, you don't really notice it with as the importance that it used to have. It was an important, whaling captain house, and now it just looks like one of several large-scale houses on the street. You really don't notice it anymore. So I couldn't agree with Myrna more. I think that the whole streetscape is really what has to be taken into consideration as much as the individual houses.
Can that be legislated? And I'm not sure, maybe if you could...
I have no idea.
I mean, you're talking about codifying a much larger... Go ahead.
One thing that has been done sometimes in historic districts is that and they use it specifically for that as form-based zoning. So you have an overlay that's not based on exactly a setback from the street. And that used to be a problem in Sag Harbor because you had that 35-foot setback when all the houses, let's say on Glover Street, they were like 15 feet back. So suddenly, if you have one that breaks the street front for whatever the reason, the ranch house that's 35 feet back that somebody wants to turn into a mini historicized McMansion, that is breaking with the street front anyway. So in form-based zoning, it's not that it must be a 15-foot setback. You take a whole street and you look at where the houses are set back. What's the range? Are they set back between 15 and 20 feet? Well, then 15 feet should be the setback in order to maintain the street front. And the same thing is true volumetrically. If all the houses on the street are only 25 feet high as opposed to 35 feet, then that should be the cap on the roof limit. And so basically you're giving an organizational tool for how to build in a way that's not, one size fits all. It must be this setback or that setback. It can be within a little range, but it keeps the scale and the massing in proportion to whatever else is on that street. And so this has been done in many communities, and it involves bringing in some consultants to actually write a new code for it. So I throw that out to all of you, but you could have an overlay on the district that would, greatly help this type of problem.
I know in my time covering boards, the ARB used to take, scale and...
We
still
actually
do, yes.
do.
Yeah.
And the additions are subservient, they're set back, the ridge line of the new addition is lower. We take into consideration, I think Anthony and it brought up earlier, just because your lot can take on a GFA of 4,000 square feet, we take it into account the buildings that are neighboring, the adjacent, and the streetscape, the trees and everything else, and go from there. We do not, okay, you can have a 4,000 square foot. And
Right.
So all these things are under consideration. It is not, I guess, somehow in the code that we follow that, but we go to the streetscape and we walk the street and we look at the houses that are there, the neighboring contributing structures, and we go from there.
Would the kind of zoning, and I'm going to pass this on to this young woman over here, the kind of zoning that Ann was describing, would that be helpful in Sag Harbor? And Brian, I'd like to have you weigh in on this also a little bit, playing devil's advocate. At what point does it become genetic engineering?
It would be very helpful. I had a development client that was looking at a property near WLNG, and he brought in his high-powered real estate agent. And she was like, yes, you can put, this is where the 4,000 square feet comes in. And there's a blank piece of property, it's half acre, but you could, I guess, in theory, with the code, put a 4,000 square foot house there. But there are all these little cottages back over in that area, and it's like, there's no way that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And in his program, he needed a 4,000 square foot house and a pool to make, the profit that I was like, you're not going to get that passed through the board, even though that you know me. I have to recuse myself, but the fact of the matter, that does not work. So if it is spelled out somehow in the code, so it's easier for the people going in to buy properties, and I think it's confusing if you look at the code.
Yeah, I think one of the things is one of the problems specific to Sag Harbor is this more or less one size fits all zoning, and I think it's I don't think just making one size fits all zoning more restrictive is the answer here. I think it's just going to lead to more situations like what I was describing earlier about where it may actually hurt you when you're trying to do something with something sensitive to a historic house, because this zoning won't allow you to do the more historically sensitive approach to it. So I think the idea of an overlay kind of thing is the way to go as far as that.
Yes and no. I think I'm a little bit concerned. Where I agree with Ann about setbacks, I think a good rule of thumb is to take the average of the setbacks to the left and to the right of, we're talking about infill, and then come up with a number that, makes sense relative to the surrounding houses. But in terms of volume, I think we don't solve the problem of what I described about, as I keep saying, the cadence, the little house that sort of separated the importance of two other houses. One way around that, I think, and I think the boards are working on this, is to look at least in that particular case, to look at what's considered a contributing structure. I mean, now we have the CRIS book, the Creative Resource Information Systems book, that lays out all 830 contributing structures, but that was based on how old they were, and this was done in 1990. A lot of time has passed since then, so the fact of contributing structures being, or structure being considered contributing, has to move forward in time, and that's being worked on now. So a little cottage like Lorraine's cottage, which was probably built in the 30s, 40s, or 50s, I don't know when, might have been considered contributing and couldn't have gone through a wholesale demolition the way it is now. That said, maybe there had been a little historic house there, which I guess would have been protected. So it's just, I don't think what Ann described really helps with the question of volume. That said, so much of Sag Harbor is already developed at this point. I don't know if it's, going to be a big issue moving forward.
Mm-hmm. This young woman had a question.
There was a court case in Southampton in the fall of 2018 where the ARB allowed a large structure, and it was litigated, and the ARB was found to be at fault for not considering scale and harmony, which is in the code. So I've always thought that was a very interesting ruling, and that gives backbone to the boards to say, sorry, but this does not fit in with scale and harmony. I live in a 1,000 square feet house, and across the street, built 2 years ago, it's 7,500 square feet, I think. It's still on the market.
So I think just to that point,
Go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to say to the point of changing the zoning code, I think, further restrictions on the code, in a way will limit property values, going back to the earlier comment about, sellers looking to maximize. So we're in a village where our zoning code is based on R20, so residential lots 20,000 feet, and more than 80% of the village lots don't conform to zoning. So the argument, it could be said, we have an overly restrictive code, which requires more review, because all development is reviewed based on a 20,000 foot lot, where you have village lots that are 6,000 feet, where the code requires them to meet 20,000 foot setbacks. So that's when they go to the zoning board, they go to the architectural review board, they go to the harbor committee. So we do see all that review, and those boards do review, streetscape, massing, setbacks, pyramid. So I think it works to that extent, where a majority of the lots being developed need more than one board's review. We're also in an area that's in a FEMA flood zone, so our code doesn't contemplate what happens when you build a house with FEMA. So our maximum height in the village code is based on grade, not FEMA. So if you have to lift your house 6 or 7 feet to comply with the new codes for FEMA, you're shrinking, you're keeping that mass down and that infill down, because you still have a maximum of 35. So you're now building a shorter house. And with your pyramid issue, the same thing. Pyramid starts at existing natural grade. So if you're 5, 6, 8 feet out of the ground to comply with FEMA or to put in a new septic system, you're already up against it with respect to FEMA. Adjoining municipalities have an allowance for FEMA, or that's just an example of what's going on there. So I don't think further restricting the code would change anything that's going on now. I think it's difficult now with some of those things.
I just want to say I'm so for education in all aspects, but I think we need to reach our real estate people very strongly on this when they're selling, of what they are, the restrictions, or what the village means, and so on. Let's get to our whole, we have an awful lot of them in the area, but let's get to them with a forum or something.
So I think that's a great point. Sitting up here listening to all the speakers, I think, now having the mayors here, I think the village has a good law in effect now that you have to update your C of O, and the C of Os are updated upon transfer, if people are familiar with that. So perhaps listening to everybody, and as a suggestion, if there's a house that's historic or contributing, if that was just stamped on the C of O, when a broker goes to look at the C of O, when a buyer goes to look at the property, or a seller, now you have that information, and now you have an idea of further restrictions on that lot in terms of education. So it could be as simple as just stamping on that C of O, historic, contributing structure. Then it's out there and no one can say they didn't know, as one possibility.
Thanks. Emma? And then Chris, I'm going to throw you under the bus.
Thanks, Brian. I'm Emma Walton Hamilton, and Nada, you read my mind, because I was actually going to ask a question about realtors and education, and it's interesting that there are no realtors on the panel today when they are such a, well, okay, that's true. I think of you as our mayor, not a realtor, but I guess that's a, But to me, that is such a key part of managing expectations. And perhaps, Bob, I don't know if when you bought your house and were brainstorming your 2 swimming pools, if you had a conversation with your realtor about that, how your realtor responded or whether that conversation took place. We are in our house is an old Victorian farmhouse. It's not particularly contributing. We are in a historic district. But 22 years ago, when we bought our house, our realtor, who's sitting behind me, presented us with a beautiful packet of information about the history of our house. Newspaper articles and lists of previous owners and information about changes that had been made over the years and so forth. And I don't believe that was obligatory, but it certainly contributed to our love of the house. We still have that package of information today. And I would love to know what kind of dialogue, if any, takes place between the village and the realtors. There's a big difference between the kind of realtor that Susan is, who prepares a package like that for a family, and the realtor who stands by the door on their cell phone while the client tours the property and doesn't really have any dialogue about expectations.
I mean, when I was talking about education, I was implying, at least, maybe I wasn't explicit enough, that the real estate agents are the first point of contact. So obviously, I think they're crucial. They're the people who set expectations. To answer Emma's question, nobody in their right mind could have ever anticipated that I would have wanted 2 swimming pools. So it's not. Brian, I have changed. Do not hold this against me. I brought it up as an example of how people can change. But I did have the pleasure of working with Susan. I want to point Susan out 25 years ago when we bought our first house in Sag Harbor. And I loved that house so much that we actually held on to it until about 3 or 4 years ago, and Susan sold that too for us. And I didn't really have the experience with, when we bought the house on Jefferson Street, there were 4 agents involved in that house because it was such a special property. And I never really, at least as far as the listing goes, I never really talked to any of them about that. But I have since seen many examples of projects that I would consider, now having learned a little bit, inappropriate. And when asking the homeowner, what made you think you could do that, the answer was pretty straightforward. Oh, my agent told me I can basically do what I want. And that includes swimming pools on tiny postage stamp size lots and things like that. So I go back to what Nada says. I mean, that is the first point of entry into the village very often for people, and the agents need to set their expectations. I mean, kumbaya, it'll make for a much happier community if everybody knows what they're getting into from the beginning.
Thanks, Bob. I actually, since we have a couple of...
Just as we put together this what to expect or what it means to live in Sag Harbor, one of the things we are going to try to do is a presentation for the real estate offices in Sag Harbor, but beyond. I don't have a clue what the numbers are, but I would say more houses are sold from brokers in other offices than Sag Harbor, too. So it will be a matter of getting it out and trying to do it. But there will be a presentation that goes along with that really... Please.
Thanks. Ann?
Well, also, our Historic Preservation Commission, we are now, one of our goals this year was to do 6 presentations to the community, from the real estate community, the Rotary, the Legion Hall, homeowners associations, the historical societies, and public venues. And when we've had them, a lot of people have shown up. So this is what our Landmarks Preservation Commission has taken on, and we have a whole package, and we just, any one of us can give the presentation, but it goes to education. And we're always amazed at how many people, come up to us afterwards and say, I had no idea, I never knew. And so that would be such a valuable thing to do. I just want to chime on.
Susan, as a realtor, can you tell me what the feeling is in the real estate agent community, the willingness of agents to act as a first line of defense, and what actually happens?
I think I would say in general, people who are in the real estate world want to offer assistance. I mean, that's what we do. On the other hand, people in the real estate world could be operating out of a Montauk office and tomorrow showing something in Southampton. So there is no way that, we're no longer a tiny little hamlet, that if you want to see Sag Harbor, you find through your friends, through your connections, a good Sag Harbor agent. I mean, we wear a lot of different hats. I'm somebody who I live here. I love it. So I naturally gather this information. But I will tell you that there are a couple big frustrations being in the line of first defense. I feel, for instance, many, many years ago in a real estate meeting out here, someone from Albany came out and said, hey, we're going to help all of you because we're going to have a document that a seller has to either fill out that has information about what they know, has there been a crack in the foundation? Did they have a fire? Is there water every time it rains in the basement? And we're going to have that available for the sellers of properties. But by the way, a seller only needs to give $500 credit at closing and not sign this. I raised my hand and I said, what good is this? After a buyer has seen a dozen or 112 houses, selected a house, this information is not on the kitchen table, they can't review it, they select, they negotiate, they go through the process. This happens at closing. I said, what good is that? And in a way, I feel that some of the information, I've been doing this really in earnest since 1990 in our village. And you would think that by now I kind of knew it all. I don't. And I feel what I would like ideally to do my job 100% right. I would like every person who wants to sell a house in this village or within Sag Harbor to have to go and sit down with Tom Priato, go to their architect, get the information. I can go, and I do this all the time, I go through, your file in the building department, and I get the survey, which is not recent. I get the C of O. I get any open building permits. But that doesn't tell the story that the buyer wants to hear when they're looking. They want to hear, okay, this is 1/3 of an acre with a 1,200 square foot house. How big can I go? I'm not the expert at that. I want to, for all the reasons you've discussed, ideally, I would like to have that information, say, here's what you have to go through. Because if you're a buyer, you're going to say, well, are you telling me I have to buy the house, and then only when I start going through the process do I find out, uh-oh. So I'm willing to go to school as much as it takes. I'm willing to do anything, just as many other real estate agents are. But this is a real problem. And I really feel in a way that just as you were saying about the people who already own, that there's a lot of weight there. Because if you are passionate and you have a house and you've lived your life, but now you're ready to move on, that person, more often than not, only wants to say, hey, there's room here. You can change my bungalow. They just want to get the highest number they can, and even if they themselves, and I'll find out if I go to the building department, but I won't find out the whole story. They may have made proposals. I'm having this right now, and I find plans in the building department, filed 2 years ago as a conversation piece. But nothing is in there telling me why they didn't get a go-ahead. And I'm saying, how can I find all this information, and both be doing the job I'm hired to do by the seller and also be properly giving the right information to the buyer? That's a problem.
Sorry. I get I get a range of prospective clients. I get this range from the client who's purchased a house and they already know about the process, and they already know what the limits of their property are, and they know they have an A or B to deal with. They know there's complicated zoning. They, even if they don't quite get all of the historic value yet, they at least know what they're up against when they bought the house. Then they'll get on the other opposite range. They'll get somebody who will say, A or B? What A or B? So. I think there needs to be something on that sort of first, on that real estate first line of really kind of educating prospective buyers and setting their expectations right at the beginning of what they can do with their property.
Brian, just a minor point, and this is not a criticism, Anthony, but I think it would, words matter in education. I think it would really be helpful for, listen, all of us sitting here paid $35 to be here to talk, well, we didn't, but to talk about an issue that we all, do we have to? What? Later? Okay. An issue that we really care about, which is preservation. So at least starting from us, let's refer to the board by its proper name, which is the Board of Historic Preservation and Architectural Review. I think it's important that be repeated over and over again so people will realize that we have the rule of local law to support the decisions that Dean and his group make. And, that's important for people to understand. So let's all take a pledge. Board of Historic Preservation and Architectural Review.
I was reminded many times by by one of the first chairmen of the ARB, that the first part of that is historic preservation. And that was done intentionally to underscore the need for preservation. Chris?
So full disclosure, Chris Tice, I'm a Corcoran agent out of our Sag Harbor office. And I just want to build on what Susan said, is I think that most agents, and the agents that I've worked with, regardless of firm, want to do the right thing. And, most agents put in their time. It makes it much more complicated when you're dealing in the historic district. If you're not, you can go to the town, usually the town, and you get the file pulled, and you can meet with someone in the building department, and you can ask the basic question of what can you do with this property. So if you're working with the buyer, you find out ahead of time, and you say, I met with the building department, and here are the general parameters, and here's how hard they feel it may be to get a variance if you need a variance or whatever. In the historic district, it becomes much more challenging, obviously, because you don't know until you dance with them, what you can do. And you really aren't going to go through that investment unless you buy the property, right? I mean, because sometimes it takes a protracted amount of time. So it makes it much more difficult. But I think that in terms of education, that what would be extraordinarily helpful is to have very easy, simple education that is available on the website. Because a lot of times we're dealing with buyers that are not in the district. And I'm emailing them things. Here's where you can find the code. Here's where you can refer it for your architect. 'Cause sometimes the architects are not local, even though I think most local agents say engage a local attorney and engage a local architecture firm, because they really understand not just the law, but also the process. And they've been through it, and they have experience, and they can give you guidance you can't get from outside this area. But I think the more that we can also have accessible online and have it be in English. When I send, I'll send, the email link to the code. Yes, yes. But a lot of times it's very hard, and this is not just Sag Harbor Village. You go to East Hampton or Southampton, you go to their websites, and it's really hard to find things, and then it's hard to find them in a way that is makes sense. So, but overall, I think the agent community wants to do the right thing. I mean, what's most frustrating is when you see a local listing from someone outside the area. And a lot of times that's where you'll see that things are misrepresented. But no agent wants to be in a transaction that's misrepresented, so just help us. That's what I'd say.
Brian, can I just add something? So several years ago, board members of Safe Sag Harbor spent easily over a year going to every single meeting that was happening, meaning the review meetings, the zoning board, planning meetings, Board of Historic Preservation and Architectural Review meetings, and realized that there were certain deficiencies, both in the way the code wasn't protecting the village and procedural things. So we did come up with a pretty intensive package of procedural suggestions and code change suggestions, many of which were ultimately implemented, certainly when the GFA, the gross floor area ratio was implemented. But this is sort of a warning to Kathleen that you are going to be receiving a package in the mail of our suggestions, just based on concerned citizens' observations of what wasn't working, including a checklist. And hopefully this will be reviewed with a little more interest than it was last time.
Well, and if there's one place where you can see not just the village code, but here are the boards that exist. Here's a link to the boards. Here that so that you're not. It's like not a hut and peck kind of process.
And here's the map. One of the things that I really want
One
of the things that I still have to question all the time is, what is the process? Where do you go? And it's a flow chart, and it's, you go here. If you bought on the water, you go there. If you bought contributing, you go here first. If you didn't buy contributing, you can go there first. It's very hard. And that's one of the reasons why it didn't come out this fall, because we're still working on that flow chart.
Emma?
Just to continue on with this idea, I think, and forgive me, I'm a writer, so this is how I think, but history is story, right? It's all about story. It's about narrative. So from my point of view, what I would love to see, and this may be pie in the sky, I don't know if this is possible, maybe this is something that the Sag Harbor Historical Society can help with as well, is more narrative when it comes to these historic districts and houses. So what we got in our package when we bought our house was the story of our house, not just whether it had a fire or what the code was in our neighborhood or, what the windows were, history of the windows were, but the fact that it had been built by the farmer who lived in the house next door and built our house and the other house next to it for his two daughters. And then who lived in it after that. And the story is what turned us on. And that's what I think we need more of. I mean, it's all very well to just have information about the codes and what you can do and you can do and can't do and the structure and the history and so forth. But we need to capture the narrative of the history of Sag Harbor in these houses and on these streetscapes in order to engage buyers in wanting to preserve that story.
You want to do that? Want to volunteer to do that, Emma?
Thanks. Susan?
I have one question for the panelists, and you may not know the answer, but this is a segue into your February session. The Sands designation was for a cultural district. There are very few of them, and I can't tell you that I understand the difference between a historic district and a cultural district, but I wonder if either Dean particularly or Bob or anyone has looked at that distinction.
I guess I'm the designated explainer. A historic district is really about the buildings. They're historical. Of course, they're structures. And to a point that was made over on this side of the room, integrity enters the picture because you could have an extremely dilapidated 18th century period building which is so lacking in integrity in terms of later changes in its historical conditions, et cetera, that it's no longer worthy of protection or designation, et cetera. So that's logical. That's an integrity issue. But to your point of what is a cultural resource, if it is also a building, then you have potentially an essential conundrum, because the building itself may not meet the architectural criteria. It may be someone's birthplace. It may have been built by someone of historical note in the community, but as a structure, it no longer has the characteristics, qualities, integrity, etc., that a comparable building of a similar period might have had it been built in an architectural style and still maintained its early characteristics. So we're really talking about two separate and at times conflicting principles. And it's very hard, and I foresee this as a challenge for the Architectural Review Board to manage two historic districts, one being a historic district, the other being a cultural resource district, if you will, with the same criteria. Because one of the criterion, for example, that the ARB presently uses is that of any addition must be subservient to the existing structure, so that what it presents to the street is what you appreciate as being the historical resource. And if you're granted permission to perhaps put on an addition, et cetera, you still want to preserve the qualities, the characteristics of that original building. You want to see that from the street. Well, how do you apply those criteria to a modest building which has been deemed of great historical merit and interest and worthy of preserving, but as a structure, if it's occupying a half an acre of land, how does a future owner maintain the presence of that building and still be granted an addition of some sort within the applicable zoning codes, which permit something that's perhaps 3 or 4 times as large? So this will become a great challenge for the board. I think other communities have faced this and perhaps have drawn up additional criteria that can be used alternatively. For example, directly to the Sands communities, one of the wonderful qualities of those properties is that they're still quite wooded. There's a wonderful sort of more rural wooded quality, which is not present throughout the village as a primary characteristic. And so that is certainly something that the board is going to want to urge homeowners to preserve. And they'll weigh the preservation of that against what might be considered permissible in terms of additions and lot development. But I see this as a big challenge, and it's been identified as a potential issue that needs to be thought about, because I think in all fairness, when the original National Register district was created here in the village, it was over time accepted and endorsed as local. So that was the premise. It was a National Register district, and with that becomes local. Similarly, with the Sands Historic District having been granted National Register district status, it is logical that the village will entertain the application of that for local recognition. That's simply a logical path. Okay. Yeah, and the difference is that if you, whether you have an individual building or a district, if you're listed on the National Register of Historic Places through the state office, that's a distinction, that's a status that you enjoy, but you're not subject to any local control in terms of the building department or an architectural review board or things of that nature, because it is truly national, and there's no national or state enforcement body that's looking to see what you're doing with your property. Once it becomes adopted as a local landmark or a local district, that's when the jurisdiction of the review board comes in, and the building department similarly. So now you do have a building inspector who comes out and makes sure that you restore the porch you were supposed to, et cetera. So that's where local control begins. And there's a logical or predictable resistance to wanting to have that control. It's enjoyable to be recognized as a nationally registered property because that conveys significance, et cetera. But it doesn't impose any local control on what you want to do. So that's the point that we're at with this.
Thank you, Zach.
I answered that, but
yeah. We'll take 1 or 2 more questions. We're kind of running a little bit late.
Barbara Schwartz from the Sag Harbor Historical Society. We do have wonderful resources that a lot of people don't take advantage of. We have files on many of the historic homes in Sag Harbor, not all of them, but and also the library has a wonderful collection of stories and information on historic houses.
Great. Thank you, Barbara. We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Anybody have anything that they're yearning to say? Yes, we do have one in the back.
Hi, I'm Tim McGuire. I'm on the zoning board in Sag Harbor. I'm neither burning nor yearning, but just a couple of observations. What we see in our board is the major pressure for big development is coming from developers. They know exactly what they're doing, and it doesn't matter what a real estate agent might say to them. So I would urge us to look at our penalties, and as has previously been said, time might be the most significant one. Although we have developers that come before us, and they don't even seem to care about time. They're willing to go through the courts and spend a couple of years in order to force through variances that our board has denied. The second thing, just a point, is that we've been kind of talking about the trees in terms of individual houses, and that's the way things come before the zoning board, one project after another. But looking at the forest, there are still a lot of areas within Sag Harbor that are ripe for and are going to be developed over the next 10 years. And it would behoove us to have some kind of plan about what we want all that to look like. And the area that I would pay a special attention to begins with Cor Maria and extends on both sides of Bay Street through the Malloy buildings, rounding the corner, continuing on Long Island Avenue, the 7-Eleven building and all those things in there, where Espresso is, the building that's going to be next to the post office. The gas ball property is going to be sold soon. What will that be? And on. Other communities, I'm thinking of Nantucket as a good example. They've got a plan that extends not just to preserve the historic community and the individual buildings, but what about new construction? What do you want it to look like? Right now, it's just each thing has its own reason for going through, and people come back and look at it and say, oh, why did they do that? Well, it had its story, and it made sense, but it may not fit into what we all might think a better master plan would be. And I won't go over and point fingers at the individual things. Some of them aren't even finished yet. But when people see them, they may be unhappy. But that thing had a reason. It created a park. There might be some other reason that caused something else to be built. So each one has its story. But if it doesn't fit in, if it could fit into a master plan, that master plan might subsume the individual story that justified that happening. So I'm just throwing that out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Hey, Brian.
Yes, Bob?
I just want to say, I couldn't agree with you more, Tim. I think we need a master plan, call it a comp plan or a master plan. There's been a lot of conversation both ways about it. I know Safe Sag Harbor completely endorses the idea of a master plan, and I personally, or comp plan. But anecdotally, there was a master plan put together in 1972 by the Suffolk County Commission that basically they didn't call for it, but they anticipated a new highway running east-west to East Hampton, cutting through Oakland Cemetery and Massachusetts Park and Madison Street, and then there was going to be a continuation of 27. I forget where that ran to, but the response in the master I forget, but the master plan actually called for the development of what are now designated or wetlands behind Garden Street. They wanted to put a multi-level apartment building there, a parking lot, sort of a mall-sized parking lot like what you could get at King Cullen, and a department store. So let's just make sure we have the right master plan. That's all I say.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to turn this back over to Gavin right now.
Thank you. All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you to our panelists for coming today. Thank you to our sponsors. And it seems appropriate that next month we'll be back here talking about the Sands communities and what that all means in a little more depth. Have a good day, everybody. Thank you.